Tonight, of course, we're in Numbers chapters 19 through 21. I appreciate Cody taking the class last week. 19, 20, and 21. Here is the outline for the book. We are in, obviously, chapter 19, and we're getting close to the end of Israel traveling to Moab, that middle point there that you'll notice on the screen. And then from that point, once we get to the end of chapter 21, Israel will be in the plains of Moab through the rest of Numbers. Leviticus takes place, is revealed at Mount Sinai. So Numbers chapter 21, verse 35, all the way through the end of Deuteronomy. They're all in the plains of Moab, waiting to cross over the Jordan River and take over the Promised Land. So that brings us to chapter 19. And this is the broad question that covers all of chapter 19. What was the purpose of this ritual with the red heifer? Purification from what? More specifically, not sin, but water. Well, it uses water, and we'll talk about that. Purification from dead people. Uncleanness from touching dead people. All of chapter 19 has to do with dead people. Think about what has gone on over the last 8 chapters. God has been killing people right and left, hasn't he? Going back to chapter 11. Now, chapter 10, they were still at Mount Sinai. I was in chapter 11. What was it? Halfway through chapter 10. There's my outline. Chapter 10, verse 10, they were still at Mount Sinai. Chapter 10, verse 11 is when they started moving. And chapter 11 is where the Israelites were complaining about the quail that they were eating, the manna they were eating. And of course, God sent a plague and killed a bunch of those whiners. And then we studied chapters 13 and 14 where the Israelites sent out spies and they came back. And a lot of them got killed because they turned around and tried to invade the Promised Land after God said, okay, no, I'm going to make you wander around in the wilderness for 40 years. And then last week you studied about the rebellion of Korah, those 250 leaders, and how God opened up the earth and swallowed them. Anyway, up to this point, as far as the specific numbers is concerned, God has killed almost 15,000 of the Israelites. Plus the promise, of course, that those fighting age men are all going to die before they enter the Promised Land. So there is death all around them. We don't know exactly, when chapter 19 happens, they're going to wander around in the wilderness for 40 years. They left Mount Sinai in chapter 10. We don't know exactly when during that 40-year period that these events take place. So chapter 13 and 14 is basically right after they leave Mount Sinai. From the time we get from chapter 14 to the plains of Moab and Deuteronomy is 38 more years. But where does this happen during that 38-year period? We don't know. God is not concerned about giving us an exact timeline, an exact chronology. So if it's at the early part of that 38-year period, then there's going to be a whole lot of death coming because God says everybody, all the men, they're fighting age 20 years and up is going to die. So there's going to be a lot of death if there hasn't already been all of those deaths.
That's a lot of folks, too.
That's a lot of folks. That's a lot of burying or cremating. Probably burying. We don't know. So God gives Israel this ritual to deal with people who touch dead bodies. Take this red heifer. I'm just hitting the highlights. Verse 3, give it to Eleazar the priest. Now, who is Eleazar besides a priest? The text says he's a priest, but who is Eleazar? One of Aaron's sons. He's to go outside the camp. He's to slaughter that red heifer. You're to take its blood. You are to sprinkle it towards the front of the tent of meeting 7 times, verse 4. And then you are to burn the heifer, verse 5, and its blood shall be burned. Everything shall be burned. Then the priest shall take cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet, cast it into the midst of the burning heifer. And then the priest shall wash his clothes, bathe his body, but the priest will be unclean until evening. And then somebody else who burns the heifer shall wash his clothes and bathe in water, and he shall be unclean until evening. And then apparently a third individual, a man who is clean, will gather up the ashes of the heifer, deposit them outside the camp, and Israel shall keep this, the ashes combined with water, keep it as water to remove the impurity. It is purification from sin. So that particular water with the ashes of that burned red heifer and the cedar and the hyssop and the scarlet, somebody let a fly in. They're to keep that water, and we'll notice that that water is referred to periodically through the rest of this chapter. Okay, so then verse 10, the one who gathers the ashes of the heifer, this is that man I think that was mentioned back in verse 9. He shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening, and this will be a perpetual statute. Now notice verse 11. The one who touches the corpse of any person shall be unclean for 7 days. That right there is the center of this red heifer ritual. What's the ritual status of someone who touches a dead person? Unclean for how long? A week. Now, why wasn't it the case that Jesus became unclean when he touched that dead person? Luke chapter 7, for example. Why didn't he become unclean? Because he can't be unclean? He raised him from the dead. He wasn't dead after he touched him, was he? When he took Jairus' daughter by the hand, she was dead. But as soon as he touched her, she was alive. Yeah? Okay, so this particular one, verse 11, the one who touches this the corpse, that one shall purify himself from uncleanness with that water, the water from the red heifer. Verse 13, anyone who touches a corpse, the body of a man who has died, and does not purify himself, based on the teachings of this specific chapter, defiles the tabernacle of the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from Israel. Now the phrase cut off from Israel could mean one of two things. Sometimes it means that the person will be put to death. Sometimes it means he will be kicked out of the assembly of Israel. One of those two. Here, I don't know exactly which one God means. Because the water for impurity was not sprinkled on him. In other words, he did not follow the red heifer ritual. Verse 14. What's the status of an object that is touched by an unclean person? The object is unclean. Verse 14. When a man dies in a tent, everyone who comes into the tent, everyone who is in the tent shall be unclean for 7 days. Verse 15. Every open vessel which has no covering tied down on it shall be unclean. Anyone who is in the open field who touches one who has been slain with a sword or who has died naturally, or a human bone or a grave, shall be unclean for 7 days. So in, I believe it's Judges chapter 14, Samson touches the corpse of the, what was it, donkey? If he was unclean, we don't read of him doing anything about it.
There was a good chance that you were going to be unclean at some point.
A good chance you're going to be unclean at some point. Yeah, because, we are much more removed from death in the United States than a lot of societies are, right? But in a lot of societies, I'm thinking of places like India, they deal with a whole lot more than we do, don't they? And of course, back then, they especially would deal with it. Now, two things here relative to the New Testament. One is, you remember in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus criticized the Pharisees because they whitewashed their tombs. Well, they whitewashed their tombs because of this law right here. You didn't want to touch a tomb on your way into Jerusalem to celebrate any of the feasts, Passover, Pentecost, or what have you, because then you would be unclean and you'd miss the feast. So the Jews would bring attention to the burial places by whitewashing their tombs so that the Jews could avoid them. Now, of course, Jesus uses that as a metaphor for the Jews themselves looking religious on the outside, but not being spiritually minded on the inside. That's one application, or one connection to the New Testament. And right now, I can't remember the second one I was going to make.
Was that something that God wanted them to do?
Whitewashing the tombs? No, that's something they came up with. But that reminds me of one of the big controversies, of course, between Jesus and the Pharisees was washing their hands after they went to the marketplace, right? Well, what are you going to do when you go to the marketplace? Touch dead animals. Now, the Pharisees reasoned that you might, notice that, contingency, you might have touched a dead animal. And so you needed to wash your hands all the time. So that was the hedge. Jesus refers to it as a hedge. They put this hedge up around the law. Well, you're not supposed to violate the law, but if you want to create a hedge, that's between you and God. You can't turn your hedge into God's laws. You can't bind other people. You can't make other people live within your hedges. And that was the sin that the Pharisees were committing. So that all relates to this law right here, where touching a dead body makes you unclean. So where did I leave off? Verse 17, the unclean person shall take some of the ashes of the burnt purification from sin, flowing water, add to them in a vessel. Clean person will then take hyssop, dip it in the water, sprinkle it on the tent, the furnishings, the persons, the one who touched the bone, the one slain, the one dying naturally, or the grave. Then that clean person shall sprinkle on the unclean on the third day, and on the seventh day he shall purify him from uncleanness, and he shall wash his clothes, bathe himself in water, and be clean by evening. Now, living in a society that did have to deal with death on a regular basis, going through that kind of process would encourage you to avoid dead bodies, wouldn't it? You just wouldn't have to go through that.
You could be unclean. I mean, you could be unclean for a lot of reasons.
Yes, this is just one reason why you can be unclean. So verse 20, the man who is unclean does not purify himself shall be cut off from the midst of the assembly, because he has defiled the sanctuary of the Lord. The water for impurity has not been sprinkled on him, he is unclean. So this will be a perpetual statute. He who sprinkles the water for impurity shall wash his clothes, and be unclean until evening, and so forth. So that summarizes this red heifer law. Now let me ask you a question, a thinking question that the text doesn't answer. Why? Why did God make the Israelites go through this type of thing because of death? And your speculation is as good as mine. Because he could. Sickness. No, they bury him pretty quickly.
Why would he save people for that amount of stuff anyway?
That's the broader question. Why would God require any of these detailed laws?
Why would he want to do that?
Yeah.
They're just human beings. They have a vision,
So let's throw it out there. Why do y'all think God required these? Either specifically this law or some of the broader. Testing obedience. That's a good answer.
Giving them something.
No, I'm thinking it's
Something that they need to do to stay right with God.
something they need to do to stay right with God. Karen?
I'm thinking it's because it's before the cross, they had sin.
To help them understand the penalty for sin before the cross. Cody?
There's so many ways that you can be unclean, and to
be in God's presence or to be in that rightness with God, you had to be clean. And so you were trying to, you knew all the ways that you could be unclean, so you were trying to avoid being unclean.
Right? Because uncleanness was not necessarily sinful, but it did symbolize sinfulness, right?
Well, it separated you from the community.
Separated you from the community, separated you from the tabernacle where you were supposed to go and offer your sacrifices.
You couldn't go to the full feast and all that stuff.
Yeah, couldn't go to the feasts. Yeah, any other thoughts?
What happened when they were in war?
They became unclean, didn't they?
When they prepared?
What was that last comment?
How would they take care of it? If they were fighting the battles, how would they go stop the battle?
So they've got this support group back here who is performing all these rituals for those who are actually doing the killing. I don't know. You know, relative to that comment, there's a lot of in fact, the vast majority of these laws in the Old Testament, we don't have any further references to them in the rest of the Old Testament. And that makes it harder for us to interpret some of these things because we don't actually see Israel living these things out in their lives. So how did they handle this during battle? We don't know. Any other comments on that? Because we're fixing to get into, well, not this chapter, the next chapter, get into some battles. All right, Numbers chapter 20. Miriam dies at Kadesh. Any thought as to why God records the death of Miriam? He doesn't record the death of Zipporah, Moses' wife. Why the death of Miriam? She wasn't going to enter the promised land. Aaron, in fact, is going to die at the end of the chapter. He's not going to enter the promised land. Moses doesn't die until the end of Deuteronomy, but he won't enter the promised land. I'm going to guess that it's because she was a leader among the women. She was Moses' sister. She was a prophetess. She was, even though she had sinned back in chapter 12, she was still an influential person among the Israelites. In fact, Hosea will mention that God gave Israel Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. So Hosea raises Miriam, in a sense, to the same level as Moses and Aaron. And so my guess is her death was significant because of her position and her influence in Israel.
She started from the beginning.
Yeah, from the time they left Egypt. Yeah.
Well, not prior. She's the one who called the baby.
Yeah, she's the one that saved Moses' life. Yeah, that's right. So her significance goes all the way back to Moses' earliest years, doesn't it? Okay, so in verse 2, we've got another complaint. What was the complaint this time? No water again. Verse 3, they contended with Moses, "If only we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the Lord's assembly into this wilderness for us and our beasts to die here?" Same song, second verse. Actually, it's about the fourth verse. How did God satisfy their need on this occasion? He tells Moses to speak to the rock. Now, how is this different from what he did back in Exodus chapter 17? He told him in Exodus chapter 17 to strike the rock with his rod, the staff. This time he doesn't tell him to strike, he tells him to speak to it. But what was Moses' sin? Notice this. Verse 7, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, the first three words out of God's mouth in verse 8. Take the rod. But he's not supposed to use the rod. But God tells him to take the rod.
He didn't give credit to God, is what it sin was.
Right. I'm coming to that. I'm backing up to the rod situation. I think this is an example of where God tests us. God doesn't tempt us to sin, but God does test us. So I think God tells Moses, you take the rod, but I'm not going to tell you to do what I told you to do before. I'm going to change my instruction and see if you follow through. That's my guess. Because the first 3 words out of God's mouth is take the rod, but then he doesn't tell Moses to do anything with it. Now the rod did symbolize, in a sense, the presence of God, right? Because the rod was present. A lot of those plagues that he brought over Egypt, when they crossed the Red Sea, Moses was holding the rod up. When they fought the Amalekites in chapter 17, Moses held the rod up. So that rod symbolized the presence of God or the power of God. So that might be all it is. Take the presence, the symbol of God's presence with you. Yeah, take me with you. So then Moses takes the rod, verse 9, just as God had commanded him. But then notice in verse 10, listen now, you rebels, shall, what's the pronoun? We. Shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock? Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod. Now God went ahead and allowed water to come out because the Israelites had a need. And yet then God says to Moses in verse 12, because you have not believed me. Now what does God mean by that? God is telling Moses, you didn't believe me. That would be like an elder in the church telling a faithful member of the congregation, you didn't believe Jesus, and that's why you sinned. What does that mean? Apparently so. Moses apparently thought he needed to strike the rock. He took it upon himself to make his own decision. He didn't trust God that God was going to make the water come out of the rock just by talking to it.
You know, I was thinking about this when the whole transport of all this time now. That when the people come to Moses and they gripe and they complain and they carry on, why Moses doesn't turn around in their face and tell them, what don't you believe that God will do for us?
Mm-hmm.
And at first I thought, well, maybe that's the reason why, is because he doesn't stand up against the people.
Well, you remember Numbers 12 and verse 3 says that Moses was more meek than any man on earth. So whenever the Israelites complained against Moses, he always goes to God. He falls on his face before God. So here, God says, because you have not believed me to treat me as holy, then you're not going to go into the promised land. These are the waters of Meribah, because the sons of Israel contended with the Lord, and he proved himself holy among them. So, Moses' sin was kind of twofold. The bigger sin, as Mark said, was that he didn't glorify God. The way that was illustrated is that he didn't obey God. Our obedience to God is what shows that we glorify God. And in fact, if you look down at verse 24, when God is talking about Aaron's death, he says, Aaron will be gathered to his people. He shall not enter the land which I have given to the sons of Israel, because you rebelled against my command. Literally, the Hebrew says my mouth. You rebelled against my mouth at the waters of Meribah. So the disobedience and not speaking to the rock, but rather striking the rock, was essential to the fact that Moses did not glorify God the way he should. We cannot separate obedience from glorification. We show God that we glorify him by obeying what he tells us to do. And Moses here is a clear example of that. When he says we, yeah, it sounds like Moses and Aaron are associating themselves with the power that's bringing the water out of the rock. Yeah. Clarence?
maybe he thought we was the staff of himself, and God being present in that staff. And that these, the time before, the staff was really the key.
Yeah.
And so God just said, no, that staff is still staff.
Right. So he's giving more power to the staff itself rather than God, is what you're saying. So that might be true too. So this is the reason why Moses doesn't get to go in the promised land. So he was 40 years old when he left Egypt. He was 80 years old when he left Midian to go back to lead Israel out of Egypt. Then he wanders around in the wilderness for 40 years. So he's 120 years old, and he gets there at the very precipice of the promised land, and God says, nope, you ain't going in. Why did God punish Moses like that? Because as far as humans are concerned, he was at the pinnacle of the hierarchy, wasn't he? He was God's spokesman. He's the one that, he didn't just see these miracles that have been performed over the last 15 chapters. He did the miracles. God did them through him, but he did the miracles. And he gets to a point where he says, I'm not going to glorify God, I'm going to glorify myself, I'm going to do it my way. And so God had to punish the leader, seems to me, as an example to everybody else. Nobody's going to get away with sin in the eyes of God. Nobody. Everybody needs Jesus, and we all need Jesus on a daily basis. Nobody will ever be greater than God. Sunday night, we're going to study James chapter 4, equal in the eyes of God. And in James 4, James says that if you judge your brother by a standard that's not God's standard, if you judge your brother, then you become a judge of the law. And you can't judge the law. You can't put yourself above the law of God, because there's only one lawgiver and one judge, the one who is able to save and to destroy. James 4 and verse 12. So we'll study that Sunday night. Cody?
It's too easy for us to point the finger at the Israelites and say how much they complain at the moment when we doubt, or when we allow doubt to keep us away from God and doing what God wants us to do. We are exactly the same.
Human nature doesn't change, does it? We are like the Israelites in a lot of ways. And we're really more inexcusable because we've got the whole Bible, we've got Jesus, and we still make the same types of mistakes that they did. All right, so how did Edom respond to Israel's request to pass through their territory? They said no. Snubbed them big time. Now, eventually, God is going to send a special message to Edom that God is holding them accountable for their bad attitude towards their cousins, Israel. And that is through the minor prophet Obadiah. That's Obadiah's one chapter, and that's all Obadiah is about, is critiquing Edom, because, in fact, by Obadiah's day, Edom rejoices when Babylon destroys Israel. That's the immediate context of Obadiah's prophecy. And yet Edom, as we see here, Edom had that antagonistic attitude towards Israel forever, for a long time. All right, now, who died at Mount Hor? Aaron. And who replaced him? Which son he had? Okay, Eleazar. Notice the phrase, verse 24, Aaron will be gathered to his people. In verse 26, that phrase is distinguished from dying. So gathering to his people and dying are two different things. Gathering to his people and being buried are two different things. In the book of Genesis, he will be gathered to his people is used about 8 or 10 times. I didn't go back and double check, about 8 or 10 times. And I think an honest reading of the text would suggest that the Israelites believed that there was life after death. He was gathering to his people means he's going into the spirit world where his ancestors have already gone. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Ishmael is said to have been gathered to his people. So they died and they went to the unseen world. Now there's a lot of Old Testament scholars who don't believe that the Jews in the Old Testament times believed in life after death, but I think there's evidence that they did. And that's one of them. So, verse 26, verse 25, take Aaron and his son Eleazar, bring him up to Mount Hor. Verse 26, strip Aaron of his garments, put them on his son Eleazar, so Aaron will be gathered to his people and will die there. I'm studying Exodus chapter 29 right now, and the process, the ceremony, the ritual of taking the garments off of the high priest and putting them on the next high priest is recorded in Exodus chapter 29. That was another 7-day ritual. God likes to do things in 7 days. 7-day cycles. Yep. So Eleazar takes over, and Israel weeps for Aaron for 30 days, last verse in the chapter. The well-known priest during King David's days, Zadok, was from the family of Eleazar. Eli, 1 Samuel, Eli, the priest, is from the family of Ithamar. Aaron had 4 sons, remember? Nadab and Abihu, they didn't obey God. They got burned with fire from heaven, so that left Eleazar and Ithamar. Eleazar apparently was the third and oldest son, so he takes over right here. And then we've got some other descendants from Ithamar, as I've already indicated in Old Testament history. Chapter 21, which nation attacks Israel at the beginning of chapter 21? Canaanites, specifically those living around Arad, the king of Arad, who lived in the Negev. Remember, the Negev is the southern part of Israel. Fought against Israel, took some of them captive. They go to the Lord, which is what they ought to do, right? The Lord hears them, verse 3, and delivers up the Canaanites, and they utterly destroy them and their cities. And then they go around Edom, because Edom won't let them pass through their land. The King's Highway, if your text translates it that way, the King's Highway runs up along the outer banks of the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee. It's a widely used highway during this period of time. And Edom lived in that area, and they would not allow Israel to go through, and so they had to go around them. And because of that now, the people become impatient, verse 4, and they speak against God and Moses. And they said, there's no food, there's no water, we loathe this miserable food. So that's what Israel complains about this time. So how does God punish Israel this time? Fiery serpents. Boy, God can come up with more ways to punish people than... I mean, Llewellyn, you just don't want to push God, right? Fiery serpents. The word fiery is seraph. Fiery creatures, then, would be seraphim. Seraphim are only mentioned one time. That's Isaiah chapter 6. So sometimes they're translated fiery serpents, that fiery beings. That's not here. Serpents here is Nehushtan, the Nehushtan seraph. So fiery serpents, venomous serpents. I don't know how much you know about snake bites, but venomous snake bites cause a burning sensation as the venom starts immediately breaking down tissue and also causing blood to clot. It typically either attacks the cardiovascular system or the neurological system, one or the other. And so God sent these fiery serpents. They bit the people and they died. So the people come back, verse 7, to Moses and say, we've sinned, we've spoken against the Lord, now intercede for us, so that God will remove these serpents. And bless Moses' heart. There's that humility, Sue, coming through. He goes and prays to God for them. I think I'd be like, man, you get what you asked for. Yeah, I'll say, I'll pray for him in 7 days. Marvin?
I was thinking while I was reading this about how many people always say, I just wish I could get a sign from God. And as I was reading this, be careful, Ron, for a sign from God, because you might get fiery
Right. Be careful what kind of sign from God you ask for. Yeah, that's right. Good point, Marvin. So verse 8, the Lord says to Moses, make a fiery serpent, put it on a standard, that is, on a pole, so that everyone who has been bitten can look at it and will live. Moses makes such a one out of bronze. And if the serpent bit anyone, they looked to the bronze serpent and lived. Yeah. I imagine they probably had a whole lot of people helping Moses make that bronze serpent. Let's get this thing done as quickly as possible. Why didn't God remove the fiery serpents? As a continual test, wasn't it? If they would remove the whining out of their mouth, maybe he'd remove the snakes. 2 Kings chapter 18 and verse 4, we learn that the Israelites wind up worshiping this bronze serpent. So it stayed with them. That's the days of King Hezekiah. So it stayed with them from the days of Moses through the days of Saul, David, Solomon, all the way to King Hezekiah. They called it Nehushtan, which is the Hebrew word for serpent. And King Hezekiah destroyed it. But this object that was designed to bring them life, they turned it into an idol. So I know why God hasn't allowed us to discover Noah's Ark today. I know why God doesn't allow us to discover pieces of the cross today. I know why God hasn't allowed us to discover the veil that covered the face of Jesus, the shroud, all of that stuff. Human beings have a tendency to worship objects. We have a tendency, in fact, to want to appeal to the senses. That's why churches are going to the full band, the rock concert environment and worship services. They want to appeal to the senses because we have trouble walking by faith. In John 3, verses 14 and 15, Jesus alludes to this, not alludes to, he specifically refers to this event in that text. He says, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so the Son of Man will be lifted up, so that everyone who looks to him will be saved, believes in him will be saved. And then, of course, verse 16 is the golden text of the Bible.
This required a person to look at the serpent too.
They had to do something, didn't they? They had to look to the serpent. And I imagine trusting God's work through the serpent had to be a part of that looking too, right? Karen? They had to look up, which of course would indicate God being on the other side, right? If they had that mentality, which you would think they would, because a venomous snake bite, I understand, is painful. A couple of years ago, Pam Sales got bit by a snake down in Florida when they were down there. I started to say, unfortunately, it wasn't venomous. I mean, I'm glad it was not venomous. But it would have been really cool to talk to somebody who had actually been bit by one to find out just what did it feel like. I'm glad she wasn't. Okay. What's the title of the book mentioned here in this text that we don't have anymore? The Book of the Wars of the Lord. Moses cites the Book of the Wars of the Lord. There's another book that's mentioned in the Old Testament, the Book of Jasher. It's mentioned twice, and we don't have that in our Old Testament. We don't know. Don't look at me as if I have any answers. We don't know anything about it. There's not any information. There's some kind of source there. It's a scroll. They didn't have books, okay? It was scroll, leather, parchment, could have been clay. They referred to them all as books. Sefer is the Hebrew word. They referred to them as books, but they were scrolls. So apparently there was this scroll that had these poems in it. Maybe even verse 17. You know, verse 17 is a song. So somebody had written them, perhaps under the guidance of God's Spirit, as Moses does. And so they quote, that source is quoted there in verses 14 and 15. It's in capital letters in my translation. The Book of the Wars of the Lord. I guess that wasn't the rule of thumb when the King James Version was translated. I don't know. Okay, what did God want to do with Israel in verse 16 I'm specifically looking at? What do you want to do with Israel? Give them water. Is this the first time God has taken the initiative to give them water without waiting for them to whine about it? Now notice the travel. I've skipped over it, but I underlined it in my Bible. In verse 10, they came to Oboth. Verse 11, Iye Abarim. Verse 12, Wadi Zered. Verse 18, Matanah. Verse 19, Nahaliel, and then Bamoth. And then verse 20, they come to the land of Moab at the top of Pisgah. And of course, at the very end of chapter 21, as we already indicated, they'll get to the plains of Moab, where they'll be until the end of Deuteronomy, when Joshua takes over leadership and leads them in the promised land. Marvin?
I was just thinking, I never thought about it until now, that God just about had to give them the water that they wanted now because they needed the water, but they were afraid to ask for it after the trying response.
They were afraid to ask for water, so God has to take the initiative to give it to them. You know, as we try to teach our kids, there's a right way and a wrong way to ask for something. And I just put my foot down when the girls whined. I'd say, I'm not talking to you until you get rid of that whiny voice. I'm not dealing with that. I don't talk to whiners. All right, so we're getting to the end of chapter 21. Which nations fought against Israel at the end of chapter 21? One nation is mentioned more than any other, and what nation is that? The Amorites. Back in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 13 through 16, God promised Abraham that he was going to give his family the land of Canaan, but he says, I'm not going to do it right now because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. These are those Amorites, the Canaanites that were living in the land. So we've got Sihon mentioned first, and most of the text refers to Sihon. Sihon would not allow Israel to pass through his land, and that would have been okay if he had stopped right there. But notice he didn't stop right there. Verse 23, Sihon gathered all his people and went out against Israel in the wilderness and came to Jahaz and fought against Israel. Now Edom says you can't pass through the land, and they left it at that. Sihon went and attacked Israel. And so God says, okay, I'm going to empower my people to fight back, and you're going to lose. Verse 24, Israel struck him with the edge of the sword, took possession of his land from the Arnon to the Jabbok, as far as the sons of Ammon, for the border of the sons of Ammon was Jazer. And then verse 27, we've got a series of verses that's Proverbs about Israel taking over and God taking over all of these different villages. Even Moab, verse 29, you are ruined, O people of Chemosh. If you don't know it, you may want to write in the margin of your Bible that Chemosh is the god of the Moabites, the specific name for the god of the Moabites. And so Israel lived in the land of the Amorites, verse 31. Verse 32, they dispossessed the Amorites who were there. And then verse 33, they turned and went up by the way of Bashan, and Og, the king of Bashan, went out with all his people for battle at Edrei. And so Og fought against Israel also, took the initiative and instigated war against Israel. And the Lord said to Moses, do not fear him. I've given him into your hand and all his people. And so, verse 35, Israel killed Og and his sons and all his people until there was no remnant left him, and they possessed his land. Notice on the screen, so significant are these two wars for the nation of Israel that Sihon is mentioned 37 times and Og 22 times in the books of Numbers and Deuteronomy, but notice also in Joshua and in Judges multiple times, and then even later on, 1 Kings chapter 4, Psalms twice, Jeremiah, and even chronologically speaking, all the way at the very end of the Old Testament history in the book of Nehemiah. So God is reminding Israel over and over and over again, you defeated Sihon and Og by my power. in order to continue reminding Israel what they can do if they obey God. Any thoughts or comments or questions or anything else on Numbers 19 through 21? We're going to talk about Balaam and Balak next week. It's ironic that those 3 chapters all fit together for my schedule, covering 3 chapters a night. All 3 of those chapters deal with Balak and Balaam. And then after chapter 24, unfortunately for our interest level, most of the rest of the Numbers are just laws. There's some narrative portions in there that talk about events that's much more interesting to us, but most of it is laws. But we'll have to hit the highlights and kind of see what God expected out of Israel. Phyllis has got a happy birthday today, right? So everybody wish Phyllis a happy birthday on your way out. So I won't lead happy birthday. Okay, I'm not going to sing happy birthday. What was that, Marvin? We got some song leaders. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll be dismissed. Our God and Father in heaven, we are again thankful that we can be here this evening to study your word. We're thankful, Father, for the health that you allow us to have. Bless our service to you, Father. Help us to glorify Christ as best we can and forgive us when we fall short. Bless our families, Father. Bless our church family. Bless us with a good night's rest. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.